Hello, today we're going to be taking a look at how culture influences the way we view strengths and living well. I'd like to ask you to think for a few moments about the culture that you come from and how that culture has influenced the kind of person you have become up to this point in your life. By culture, I mean the context in which you have grown up and lived, the values of your family and your community, the various kinds of cultural influences on the choices that you've made in your life up to this point. All of these are aspects of culture. Often we don't give that much thought to our culture and how it influences the way we are and also how we may view other people. And for those of us who are in human services related fields, understanding how our own culture has influenced us is extremely important, because we might have some cultural biases that negatively affect the way we think about and relate to other people. We also need to understand the culture of others so that we can hopefully be accepting and appreciative of cultural influences in the lives of other people. So in the field of psychology generally, and positive psychology more specifically, there is some controversy about whether we can view psychology from a culture-free perspective or if we need to think of it from a culturally embedded perspective. This is so relevant to positive psychology because, as we've already seen in considering strengths from an individualistic and collectivist points of view, that what may be viewed as a strength in one type of culture might be viewed very differently in another culture. So if we take a culture-free position, we believe that psychologists can hold a neutral and completely objective stance as they analyze what they consider to be universal traits and behaviors. In other words, if we take a culture-free perspective, we're basically saying that culture doesn't have all that much of an influence on studying strengths because strengths are universal across cultures. If we take a culturally embedded position, we believe that psychologists will always be influenced by their own cultural values while examining the strengths and positive functioning of other cultural groups. If we are culturally embedded in our perspective, then we appreciate that what would be a strength in one culture might not be a strength in another culture. We would conclude that strengths in general are universal, but specific strengths vary from one culture to another. So I'd like to ask you to think about this question for yourself. Would you see yourself as being more culture-free or culturally embedded, not only in the way you view positive psychology, but perhaps in a broader sense in the way you view the world and your place in it? So when we look at the history of how culture has been regarded within the field of psychology, There are some aspects of that history that we wouldn't necessarily be all that proud of. Because when we go back to the 19th century and early 20th century, one of the first perspective that we might encounter is what's called the genetically deficient perspective. And the genetically deficient perspective basically claims that some people are genetically deficient to others based on the culture that they come from. And this would include looking at race and ethnicity as factors that would be considered in making the claim that some people are genetically superior as a group of people to other people. Of course, this perspective is one that would lead to prejudicial thinking and discriminatory behavior. And in fact, that does characterize some of the activities of psychologists and others in the late 19th and early 20th century, including efforts that were made to keep certain immigrants out of the country based on their scores on IQ tests, and the use of eugenics, where certain people were involuntarily sterilized because they were viewed as being genetically inferior. The genetically deficient perspective eventually gave way to the culturally deficient perspective. And this is the idea that some cultures are superior to others. The notion here is usually that the dominant culture is superior to any other cultures that might exist within a particular country. So if someone were to maintain the culturally deficient perspective, they would say that in the United States, they might say that the dominant European American culture is superior to all other cultural groups within the United States. Fortunately, the culturally deficient perspective eventually gave way to what we now view as being a more culturally different perspective. And this is the idea that one culture isn't necessarily better than another. It's just that cultures are different. And each culture has its own unique way of looking at the world. But even within a culture, you see a lot of variability among people who are a part of that culture. But it's not that one is better than another, it's just that cultures are different and that we can all be enriched if we can appreciate that cultural differences among us and between us and have acceptance of those variations in a way that can enrich life for all. In thinking about the world from a culturally different perspective, there are two other ways of looking at culture that come to mind, and they're also discussed in our textbook. One is when we look at culture from what's called a culturally pluralistic perspective. Plural, of course, means more than one, or even many. And when we look at culture from a culturally pluralistic perspective, say in the United States, for example, we would say there are many cultures that exist within the United States, and they all are worth coming to understand, to appreciate, to accept, and embrace. And we are all enriched when we're able to approach one another's culture in that way instead of believing their own culture is better than another. And then finally, there's the idea of cultural relativism. And this is basically the notion that to really understand somebody, we need to think about their beliefs, their behavior, relative to the culture of which they are a part. In other words, to try to understand one another in a cultural context. And when we're able to do that, then we will have a deeper appreciation for the uniqueness of individuals and also of the commonalities that connect us together as fellow human beings. One interesting notion that relates to culture, and when we think of culture in a more culturally embedded kind of way, makes sense, is what is called culture-bound syndromes. A culture-bound syndrome is a set of symptoms that are much more common in some societies than in others. I'm thinking now about different kinds of disorders that people might experience. And a good example of this would be the disorder in the DSM-5 called social anxiety disorder. In individualistic cultures like the United States, when someone experiences social anxiety disorder, basically they are afraid to be in situations where attention is focused on that person, to where the individual is afraid they're going to be criticized, evaluated, or laughed at. One of the main ways in which social anxiety disorder is manifested in individualistic cultures is performance anxiety, where the person is afraid to get up in front of a group of people and say, give a speech, or even perform athletically, and they freeze up and not be able to complete an action that they are trying to initiate, like, say, throw a ball from third base to first base. Some people with social anxiety disorder in individualistic cultures also are very uncomfortable about eating in public because they don't want people to watch them put food in their mouths and chew it up. And some men will not want to go into restrooms where other men might be watching them standing at urinals. In collectivist culture, Japan is one that comes to mind, social anxiety disorder manifests itself in a different way. There, the individual is not so much afraid that they're going to be laughed at, but they're afraid they may offend the other person by making eye contact at the wrong time, giving off a body odor or something of that nature. So you can see how whether a culture is individualistic or collectivist comes into play here, because of course in individualistic cultures, as we've already looked at, it's all about me. But in collectivist cultures, it's all about the group, other people. So when we understand these cultural differences, it helps us to understand how symptoms might be manifested differently. But bringing it back more to positive psychology, we are reminded when we look at a difference between West and East, between individualistic and collectivist ways of looking at things, these different cultural perspectives, how what we might view as a strength in one culture may not be viewed as a strength in another culture, and other characteristics might most likely would be viewed as strengths in another culture. This is one of the main messages, hopefully, that we can get out of this discussion about culture as it relates to understanding strengths. So to help us make this point, I would like to do an exercise with you that you'll find described in your textbook, looking at hope. And we've already established how hope is more of a Western individualistic construct because it involves a more future looking orientation to life. But by doing this exercise together, it's going to help us all to think about how our own cultural background and experiences may influence how we complete this exercise. So in this exercise, looking at the power of hope, I'm going to ask you, first of all, to raise both hands. And then on the count of 3, I want you to point to where your hope comes from. Given your background, your culture, your life experiences, where do you think your hope originates? In your head? That thinking part of you? In your heart? From the love you have for others and that they have for you? Or from the holy? Your spiritual life? Now you can use both hands to point to one place if you think all of your help comes from that place. Or you can use one hand to point to one place and the other hand to point to another. So on the count of 3, point to where your hope comes from. 1, 2, 3. There you have it. So the purpose of this exercise, again, is for you to think about how your cultural influences affect the way you answer this question. Some researchers have looked into the possibility that there may be certain personality traits that help us to have a more multicultural appreciation for other people. You may find a reading about these in your textbook of interest, but there are 5 factors that have been identified that perhaps help us to have greater multicultural sensitivity. And these are cultural empathy, open-mindedness, emotional stability, initiative, and flexibility. So what are the major points that we can make in the way of summary and conclusion as we think about the role of culture in helping us to understand strengths and a well-lived life. So we might be able to conclude that psychological strength is universal in that most people have developed qualities that promote adaptation and the pursuit of a better life, but these strengths are not completely universal. A story in our book helps us to understand this point. And it is the story of the wise man of the Gulf.